From the Zimmerman Symphony Center in Canton, Ohio, this is Orchestrating Change. I'm Matthew Jenkins Yarashevitz, Associate Conductor of the Canton Symphony Orchestra.
And I'm Rachel Hegemeyer, President and CEO.
We are so glad you could join us.
This podcast navigates issues that exist in the field of classical music and the world at large. We invite you to listen with open ears as our guests share their experiences and as we discuss these often avoided topics.
Today we are joined by Blake Anthony Johnson, CEO of the Chicago Sinfonietta. He became the first African-American to hold such a position with a nationally renowned orchestra when he began his tenure in 2020. He also serves on a number of boards and committees, including the Sir Georg Solti Foundation, the City of Chicago's Department of Cultural Affairs and Special Events, and the EDI Orchestral Management Committee at the League of American Orchestras. He first became interested in orchestral management while a student at Vanderbilt University, from which he earned a Bachelor of Music in cello performance. He then completed his master's degree right up the road from us at Cleveland State University, during which time he performed here with the Canton Symphony. He went on to perform as a member of the new World Symphony and also appeared with the Cincinnati and Nashville Symphonies, among others, before turning his focus to management. Blake Anthony Johnson, thank you so much for being with us today. Welcome to Orchestrating Change.
So happy to be here. Thank you guys for having me.
Yeah, we're so happy to have you. So can you just introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about Blake Anthony as you were growing up and how you got into music and all that good stuff?
Sure. I actually quite enjoy this story because there's several stories behind it. But I always say, I am a cellist by training, a CEO by circumstance. My first cello was actually given to me by a Waffle House waitress, believe it or not. And that's a much longer story, but essentially I used to go to the Waffle House in my neighborhood where one of my sisters worked, and it just kind of came up that, I like the cello, and one of the workers was like, I think I have one of those things in my closet. And that's how I got my first cello, actually. So I started quite late, as most people know, which was a blessing and a curse. A blessing because I started so late, and because I was really interested in competitions and had a fairly okay facilitation on left hand and a good ear, I was able to compete in competitions, and I really didn't have to play things that kind of focus on the technical aspects that you really need in formal training. So I was quite successful in doing these concerto competitions. And because I was self-taught, it kind of added to the narrative. So it was like, it's not that he just won. It's like this young guy with long hair who's like kind of eccentric, is somehow competing with all these people who've been taking lessons since they were 4. And so that kind of really launched me into this crazy wave, which I'm very much still riding. So that's kind of how it started. And I'm still trying to make sense of it all, if I'm being honest.
Wow. That's so cool. And what city was that Waffle House in?
Oh, in Georgia.
Georgia.
Yeah, still in Atlanta, Georgia.
Atlanta, Georgia. Okay, very fun.
So you were self-taught until the age of 18 before you went on to Vanderbilt, eventually Cleveland State. But what was it like going from self-taught to conservatory? What was that transition like for you?
Yeah, so it's really funny because I'm going to see Yo-Yo in a little bit. And when I first got to Vanderbilt, there was this article that said, Vanderbilt, Blair School of Music, training the next Yo-Yo Ma, ? And it was just me in the practice room. Because again, everyone knew me from competitions. So it was, even how I got to Vanderbilt was kind of serendipitous in the sense that I won the Emory cello concerto, not cello concerto, but the Emory concerto competition, and played Dvorak. And somehow through there, people linked me up to Vanderbilt, and kind of the rest is history. But I think, because I've lost my train of thought already. Because now I got flooded with memories of youth orchestra. But
very good.
Yeah, you got to remind me of the question now, because I forgot.
Sorry, no. So just what was it like going from being self-taught to conservatory education alongside all these people that have been on the program since they were 4?
Oh, okay. That's a really good question. So I did something called Governor School. So the Governor Honors Program in Georgia, which is a little different in all states. And it's really different now than what it was when I was a kid. And essentially what that is like fake college for students. So you have a major, you have a minor, you can have a double major, you can have a double minor, but there's no grades. And when I was in Governor School, it was really eye-opening for me because here I am not really coming from formal education, but all of my peers are like, I debuted with the when I was 9. And I'm like, I don't belong here. But it was really nice to kind of understand that level of playing. And so I was kind of exposed to that level of playing, I would say, before I went to college. Like I knew there was more. That's actually how I got so into it. When I went to Vanderbilt, that is how I got into this whole yo-yo thing. You know, there was this article that basically said, Blair School of Music training the next Yo-Yo Ma. And Yo-Yo was at the time coming to Nashville quite a bit. So he was actually a great mentor for me. But because of that article, it reminded people like, you know, no one actually knew what I could or could not do. So at the time I was playing like this really competitive kind of showy music, like violin, you know, Paganini caprices, and I could play Dvorak, but I couldn't play like a Mozart sonata. So there was this weird kind of starting literally from zero. And so I absorbed it like a sponge. I really enjoyed just the process of trying to build back some of this lost time. And my teachers, you know, my education at Vanderbilt was really interesting because I was also in a quartet, and our quartet, as a lot of people know, we were called the unofficial quartet, and Vanderbilt actually sent us to Paris to continue our studies. And in a quartet setting, as you know, you find all the crannies and nicks of your playing because you have to all be on one accord. And so that actually accelerated my technique in many ways that I really can't imitate in any other circumstance. And then also Vanderbilt was really, really kind to me, the faculty. I mean, I still talk to a lot of the faculty to this day. I'm on the advisory for the dean's advisory for Vanderbilt. And, you know, I used to have 3 lessons a week. So I had one for technique, one for technique that my teacher was insistent on. Then I had one for repertoire that I really wanted to learn. So to think of the Paganinis, and, you know, I was like, I want to play Fatale Chacon and like play music by the cellist. And then I had a sonata class with Catherine Plummer. And that was really just about kind of collaboration, really understanding like how to put on recitals. And those lessons were on the main concert hall. So it was quite daunting actually, because you really have to learn how to do projection. And then I guess technically I still had orchestral rep. So it was a lot of lessons in a week, 3 teachers and one kind of orchestra rep class. But again, I was extremely hungry, so it worked out.
Yeah. Wow. No, from being self-taught to 3 lessons a week.
Yeah. Well, I asked for it.
Yeah.
You know, I tried the one lesson and I wrote this, it's really funny. I wrote an email to all the faculty and it was labeled My Life. And I basically was like, I can't do this. Like things are moving too slow. Like I feel like I'm not getting what I need. And really kudos to all the Blair School of Music faculty, because they basically said, okay, like what can we do to make this work for him? And what that was for me was, I was like, I want to learn at least a movement and concerto every day and perform it. I want to do all the, like, they gave me what I needed. So it was kudos to them.
That's really to have that, you know, hunger. I think it's so interesting. So you said you started late. How old were you when you actually started playing cello?
12.
Okay.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Okay.
So, you know, for some, it's interesting. So for some students that might not feel late, especially in this area, in the Canton area, some students aren't even able to or know about the cello until the age of 12. But it's so interesting how in the orchestral world, we're like, yeah, that's so late. Oh my gosh. But for me, I'm a bassoonist. So if I'm going through public school education, I had to start on the clarinet because they wouldn't let me start on the bassoon. So I actually didn't start the bassoon until I was 11 turning 12. So for me, I'm like, oh, that's not that late.
Yeah, I mean, it's tricky. I think especially it's quite late if you actually look at my performance career. So the reality is, like, the later you start, there are certain aspects just from a physical standpoint that if you didn't grow up playing the instrument, it's just harder. And there's certain skills and tools, especially when it comes to like fine motor skills, that yes, you can do it when you're older, but it is a lot more work. The flip side to that is it made me, and I'm kind of assuming here, but I think is what makes me such an attractive teacher to people, because unlike a lot of my friends who just do things just because, I mean, they wake up and they can do it, I really had to learn how to do it with a fairly already developed brain. And so kind of creating those neural pathways in terms of like the effective way to practice, the effective way to do drills, the effective way to warm up is a lot more conscious to me. And so it's much easier. I mean, that's why I teach so many students outside of cello, because I can really break down just the basics regardless of instrument, because that took a lot of work to kind of catch up.
Yeah, that's really, really unique. So while you were at Vanderbilt, and Vanderbilt's a great school. I almost went there. I love that campus, all the squirrels they talk about. It's a great place. But while you were there is kind of where you say your interest in management, arts administration, education, all of that kind of started blossoming. So what led to the interest in this administrative side besides just the performance and the music?
Yeah, I always tell people, I mean, I view my administrative career as an extension of my artistic expression. So, the only difference, rather than me being on stage, I'm doing things that facilitate what happens on stage. And as you guys know, especially with Sinfonietta, we launch all types of crazy programs that require creativity, whether it be, like I had a meeting today because we're building out a symphonic metaverse for next season. Like I still get to be creative, and I still get to do commissions, and still get to, actually, there's a really funny week that I hope we never repeat again. But long story short, we commissioned a piece, and it was by Joel Thompson, and we're both from Atlanta. And they were using a cellist that I know very well. And so there was this moment where you had the music director coaching the orchestra and the CEO like coaching the soloists and some of the principals on like how the piece should go, because I knew the piece quite well. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is so backwards. But yeah, I mean, at Vanderbilt, they were great. I mean, there's a lot of things like Vanderbilt Interest Projects, which I was the VP for, which really got me into it. Obviously quartet. So I even do this with my Roosevelt University students. I mean, being in a quartet, you learn quite a bit about management because you're essentially managing yourselves, even if you do have management. And so I like that. And then I really liked connecting with people. So things like the classical cake with Blake, which was hilarious because I had this little Chevy Cavalier car and I used to drive to the Cheesecake Factory and pick up like 40 cheesecakes. And I would get all these groups to perform in like the most bizarre locations. So whether it be the Blair String Quartet, or we would pull quartets from Aspen, or we had the Cleveland Orchestra actually do one. I had a Cleveland Rock Star week when they were on tour. Like I had a lot of flexibility, but I really loved kind of expressing, or I guess exposing people to music in really unconventional ways. And so that was really what was behind it. It was more so like, I think this is cool and I want everyone else to know that it's cool. And luckily, Nashville Symphony and Cleveland Orchestra and Aspen, like all these folks were on board. So it gave me some good experience.
That's so amazing. Fun. Cheesecake. What a great way to bring people together.
That is incredible. Yeah.
Classical cake with Blake.
Yes. I love that.
And the name too. I mean, the name could not be any better.
Yeah.
So what led you then? What was your career path from deciding, okay, I played in these great orchestras, but I'm going to go to the administrative side? What was your career path that led up to your current position with the Chicago Sinfonietta?
I always joke with people, I'm not a phoenix. I'm like, I didn't die as a musician and like get reemerge as an administrator. And then I think also what frustrates people, but it is kind of more honest, is like, like a lot of people, these paths are not linear. It's much more geometric or catalytic. And so the reality, I was doing a lot of things. Like when I was at New World, I went back to school because I really thought maybe I should go to law school. And the only reason why I passed my exams is because we had Hurricane Irma. And so I had like 4.5 weeks to just study and finish all of my exams for law school. So, I mean, there's things like this where I'm like, there's a lot of many things that I was just a quite curious person. But in reality, as most people know, I mean, what really pushed me into administration was MTT. So Michael Thomas, really important mentor of mine, and a fundamental piece of like how all of this came about. And I remember, because I was playing for him, I was preparing for Queen Elizabeth competition. I remember this very well. And I ran through the stuff and he gave me his notes. And then I was a little conflicted because I was like, I'm getting older and I got to get off of this competition train. And I was somewhat frustrated. And he was like, well, I'm glad that you mentioned it. And then we went into this whole thing of like, these are all the things that I really want you to be doing. And so New World, similar to Vanderbilt, really created the space for me to play around with things. So they let me program concerts. They let me take on education programs. They let me take on NWS Connect, which is a part of the Mosaic and the online. So, I mean, a lot of these, especially during the pandemic, when people are like, how did Sinfonietta have like a virtual concert hall like so quickly? And how did they do all this like video work? I'm like, well, because at New World, I was given license to just like play and like, create, one of the things MTT had me do was take apart a camera, like just a Nikon camera, and take it apart and all these various pieces and walk around for a couple of weeks and like figure out if I had new ideas. So like we like come to these like crazy projects from, I think, the oddest origin stories. And same thing for Howard Herring, the CEO at New World. We connected a lot through books. So we would pick a book to read, and then that would be kind of the impetus for us to like to explore like, okay, how does this relate to me or my time at New World, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, a lot of it has to do with MTT essentially saying it's time, like, yes, you can play the cello. We love that. If you want to be in this orchestra, if you work hard enough, we love that. But in reality, you really should be doing something else. And so he was really keen on like, let's give you enough space and time to figure out what that something else is. And I remember during one of the concerts at New World, because as this essentially explaining my time in Paris and my time with the quartet, but it was an orchestra concert. So it's kind of like I do a speech, they see a video, the orchestra plays, and it was kind of one of those immersive things. So the lighting of the stage and players are also telling a different story of the piece. And so it's kind of like this multi-dimension performance. But I do remember at the end of that, someone was like, so what's next? Like, what's your dream job? And I said, I don't know if it exists. I think I'm either going to have to create it or like find something that makes it my own. And so I think I've done that with, especially now in Chicago, where, I have Chicago Sinfonietta, but also have Vanderbilt University and obviously my work with the city and with, these other institutions. So I feel like I've made what works for me.
Wow.
So did you hold any other positions? Like, Rachel was a manager of education before she was a CEO. Did you hold any other positions like that?
Yeah, so, I was at Spoleto for quite a while. So I was section and then eventually principal, and then was a personnel manager at the same time. So that was for sure helpful.
Yeah.
I think people, because I get this question a lot, they're like, what exactly happened? I'm like, it's not one thing. It's like a million little things that, one of the things that I did was I oversaw an RFP process for a tour. So there's nothing really significant about that other than the fact that like we made it quite far in that process. And once people realized it was me doing it, they're like, what is going on with this kid? Like, how does he have time to do this? And like, also, how does he know how to do this? And I'm like, I just really like the business of music. And so that was part of it. I mean, when I started at Louisville with Teddy, obviously I went there for learning and community. And then I had a kind of really rapid kind of pace of promotions. And then obviously the pandemic happened. And so that also exposed me to a lot of things that I would not have otherwise done. And so I think Louisville was also very important because I got to play around a bit about what leadership really looks like. And so when the opportunity came to do it full time, I thought, why not? Like, I actually like it a lot more than I thought I did.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think I really like that you say that, because I think in the administrative side of orchestral management, everyone assumes a very linear path of how you get to leadership. And for a long time, I feel like the people who became president and CEOs, the executive directors, they were at one point the orchestra manager, or they were at one point, like, they did director of development, or they touched all these different departments. But I think, I got hired into this symphony when I was manager of education, community engagement, but, I was right out of college, but it was like all those little things, I'd done different types of I didn't ever just sit down and do administrative work. I'd done little things that added up to me having knowledge of how this works. And so I'm really glad that you said that, because I think it's important for people to know that, like, the arts management field, the arts administration field is I think there's more room for different types of people in it than traditionally. You don't have to be like, I went to school for business.
Yeah.
You know, like,
Yeah,
I don't
you
think that's
definitely have to
necessary.
learn.
You have to learn
Yeah,
it. You better learn it.
you have to learn it, but you don't have to go to school for it.
Yeah.
I always remind people, like, because I was self-taught on cello, the idea of kind of quote unquote teaching myself or putting myself in education environments in which I would learn how to be a CEO, it's not that far of a stretch. So
Yeah.
I'm like, the self-taught curiosity piece, I think, is more critical than whether or not I got my MBA.
Right. And I think the curiosity is the most important thing of, you know, I don't think you know, this is me saying something now. I don't know if I'll ever go get my master's because I'm learning it by doing it. And not that getting a master's degree isn't important and valuable, but I just think at this point now for me, I'm like, I'd rather just be working and doing and learning that way. So yeah. And you've alluded to the fact that you do a lot of other stuff too. You teach at Roosevelt, you work with the city, you're on a ton of boards and committees. Can you talk a lot, you know, maybe pick like one or two or something that just stands out to you in this moment as work outside of what is typical for someone doing your job that you feel is important and helps you be more well-rounded as a person and how you serve the orchestral field?
Sure. And, you know, one of the things that you're saying, like, it's good to share that it's not linear. You know, the orchestra manager position has become highly specialized over the last kind of 10 or 15 years, more so than people realize. So it is really difficult to find someone who has kind of the know-it-all of all the various departments. Every board has a different mentality in terms of what can someone learn on the job versus what someone needs to have coming into it. And again, I was really fortunate because I had some interim duties and jobs right before I came here. So I had some real experience before I came in, but it's a tricky thing. In terms of the work that I like outside of it, you know, this is probably a biggest pro and con in the sense that I love running an orchestra. It brings me so much joy, but as everyone knows, I love so many other things as well. I'm like, they're all my babies. And the city work specifically is really great. You know, one of the things, you know, I'm on the Cultural Advisory Council for the Department of Cultural Affairs and Special Events and a bunch of other stuff with the city. And I really love it. Like, one of the things we did recently is I went on a delegation with the mayor to both Paris and London, and people were like, what is the arts guy doing here? And I'm like, well, when you think about economic activity, or you think about business development, or you think about what a company needs to recruit talent and like sustain talent, I'm like, culture and community is actually a significant part of that. So if we can't make a valid case for like what will keep people in the city, like we might not get that headquarter, or we might not get that business. There's also just practical things in the sense that, you know, in London, they have this beautiful 24-hour city model and kind of what that means. And so when you think of like arts and culture literally touching everything from transportation to public housing to like urban development, and like arts and culture is a significant part of that. Chicago is quite unique in the sense that we are able to give recommendations to the other departments, as well as we have our own pillar in our city plan. So Chicago just went through this really crazy process of putting a new city plan, the first one in 50 years. And the first pillar that you see when you open the book is arts and culture. So, I mean, it touches so much. When you look at like cultural corridors, you know, this idea of you can put all of the money that you want to into a new grocery store or a new kind of hospital, but if you don't have things around it that can increase foot traffic, or if you don't have, you know, things that can keep people, like when I say here, because our offices are in the dominant financial sector, but if you don't have things for people to do after they get off work, you know, they want to get that beer, they want to go to a show, they want to see the theater, but like there's a lot of planning and strategy that goes behind that. So I love the city work because it touches everything from, you know, gig workers who work at night, this idea of like, if you're a female gig worker, and where do you use the restroom in between gigs, or how do you get hot food, like all of these things that people might not think of. So I love it. It touches literally every single part of the city. And so it's a never-ending learning curve for me.
Wow. And that's so important. That is something that both of us were just nodding and nodding and nodding as you're talking, because that's just so so important that our arts and culture people are strong voices in government and strong voices in our communities when it comes to development and planning and it's just so important. And I don't think people realize that in a lot of communities. And I'm so applaud Chicago. That's so cool. I'm really glad you do that.
And, it's a hugely important thing for attracting people, as you said, to a city. I mean, my fiance is from a small town, and I was like, I like visiting where you grew up, but I couldn't live there. Like I need more arts and culture. There's some there, but like somewhere like Chicago, there's everything in Chicago. My brother lives in Chicago, so I've had the good fortune to spend a lot of time there, and there's everything. There's so much to do all the time, and it's just wonderful. And the fact that you're so involved in that work is fantastic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So cool.
So another committee you serve on is the League of American Orchestras EDI Orchestral Management Committee. Tell us a little bit, why is EDI work so important to you, and why should our audience care?
Sure. My partner in crime and someone I respect greatly is Kim Noltme. She's the CEO and president at Dallas Symphony.
Yeah,
and
I love Kim.
Yeah. She was kind of why I joined that committee. I think, I do a lot of EDI work. Obviously, Sinfonietta is we live in that space daily, and that's what it was founded on. But in terms of my involvement with other orchestras and other leadership teams, I do a lot of consultation work with them. And so part of it just made sense because I already do it, but this was just a formal way to be involved. The second part is expanding people's definition or understanding of what equity, diversity, inclusion, and belonging actually means. And so I think this idea that, what works in Miami would work in New York, or what works in New York would work in, Arkansas, it's really different. So even for my students, we really go through the definitions of what does access or representation look like if you're looking at physical or cognitive abilities, or what does it look like from horizontal segregation versus vertical segregation? What does it look like in terms of who's behind the scenes, behind the lens of all the things that you see? What does it look like in terms of your investment statement policy? What does it look like for your vendors? It touches so many other things. And so that is really kind of the purpose, at least of why I wanted to be involved with it, is for people to be a little bit more creative outside of just, how many ETs do we have in the orchestra, or how many ETs people do we have on staff? I'm for you to actually do this properly, it really is every single thing.
Yeah.
Down to, who are you buying lunches or breakfast materials for staff, or who's those vendors? And so that's why I got involved. Is obviously for our field, we have a long way to go, but there's been a lot of progress. But this idea of it's just one kind of bristle, if you will, in a larger kind of paintbrush that we need to paint this new 21st century orchestra is important. And so I always tell people, I don't criticize things I don't myself throw myself into. And so this idea that I think it's really important to work in systems like the League of American Orchestras to find solutions that are not necessarily catch-alls, but at least give people proof of concept and really develop that muscle of, again, being curious, of close your eyes and imagine who you want in the room, and then open your eyes when you're at a concert or a show and see who's not there, and let's put out some plans to get them into the room. So whether that be an accessibility issue or a financial barrier, obviously we launched the Pay What You Can program, and it tickles me. I was in New York recently, and someone was like, I used to Pay What You Can ticket at Lincoln Center. And I'm like, that's so cool. I don't know if you know where this idea came from, but I really love that you have that, I'm like, that all fits under EDI. So EDIB. So I love it, and obviously it's one of many things, but it's a necessary part of the bigger picture.
Mm-hmm.
So we've mentioned a lot about the Chicago Sinfonietta so far, but most of our listeners might not be aware of your orchestra and what you do. So tell us just a little bit about the mission of the Chicago Sinfonietta and why you are unique in the orchestra world.
Oh, that's really good. So Chicago Sinfonietta, its mission, which is championing equity, diversity, and inclusion by creating community through both symphonic experiences. And so other than the EDI part, the experiences is a big part of what we do. So the audience development, when you come to a concert, you're probably going to dance. When you come to a concert, you're probably going to talk to people that you've never even seen before. Like, Mayen is quite active and has more energy than the sun. And so there's a lot of it feels different when you come to a Sinfonietta concert. Paul Freeman, who was an amazing conductor back in the 20th century, he, like many Black artists, whether it be classical or non-classical, obviously could not have the career that they quote unquote deserved in the States for various reasons. And so they went to Europe. And we are really fortunate that Paul Freeman decided to come back to the States and said, I really want to create an orchestra that represents and looks like the city in which it resides. So he created Chicago Sinfonietta in 1987. And a lot of people know us mainly because obviously on stage, we're a big proponent of representation. So I think even right now, as we do our end of year appeal, I think people don't know how many countries actually are represented in the orchestra. It's a really unique situation to have so many different people. And then obviously a lot of people know us through our fellowship program. So I won't run down every single program that we have, but I think the easiest way to understand Sinfonietta is that we are very much Chicago based, but we also have a second role in defining what like the fringes of being more inclusive and being more representative of the larger population looks like. So the Pay What You Can kind of campaign is a really good example, because when that was first announced, people were quite, I think the polite way to say is almost, more than just like against it. I mean, it was almost kind of laughed at, if I'm being quite frank. And so it's been nice to see how well it's been adopted, because I'm like, I do remember when it was first got rolled out and the response that we got, it was really interesting. And so the Pay What You Can program obviously is one of it. The fellowship, the Freeman Fellowship. So we have fellows for administration, orchestral playing, conducting, and composition. So it really is important for people to understand, like when you see Roger Cox with the Metropolitan Opera, or you see Kendrick with the Royal Scottish Symphony, I'm like, you name it. If it's a female artist or conductor or a person of color, 8 out of 10, 9 times out of 10, they actually did their training with Sinfonietta. And so it's a really important output of representation. And then obviously things like recording. So now, you can find a recording of Price, or you can find a recording of Bonds, or whoever, Hilstork. But many of those recordings, if you actually look at the dates, Sinfonietta was the first one to record them. Yeah. So a lot of these pieces, the reason why people even know what they are is because Paul Freeman did a lot of work with the African American Heritage series. Obviously, Mayen has the Project W. So this was long before you saw like all women concerts or all female kind of campaigns. Like we had the Project W recording. There's the Black Composers Project with CBS. I mean, there's a lot of just groundwork that allows so many orchestras to essentially run. So that Sinfonietta has a really interesting role in the sense that we're very much Chicago based, but we have tentacles literally all over the world.
Yeah. And just to clarify for our listeners, Mayen is the current music director?
Yes. Yeah, Maestra Mayen Chen. She's great.
Yeah. So we have had the pleasure of talking with a ton of really cool people on this podcast. One of them is Anwar Nasir. He was our first episode this season. And we talked a lot about being a Black administrator, specifically a Black executive director. And he rightfully, we pointed out and talked about for a while about how sometimes he's like, I feel like sometimes we all get lumped into one category, like we're the Black executive directors. He's like, but I'm very different than Blake Anthony. And, he's like, we're very different people. And so I just thought that was a really interesting point. Also, I think I should bring up Virginia Symphony just hired a female Black executive director, Dr. Andrea Warren, which she's the first Black female woman to be a CEO of an American orchestra. And so that's really, really exciting. But on
the heels of them having one of the first women conductors
I
and
know.
Joanne Falletta as their music director.
It's super fun. So
Who's also a dear mentor.
Yeah.
Same for me. I'm a Manus graduate, and I got to do the Julius Rudel Fellowship through the Buffalo Philharmonic.
Oh,
and to this day, Joanne is a dear friend of mine. And she was a podcast guest the first season.
So yeah, it's just so so Onward like really made me think about these unique challenges. It's why I love this podcast and talking to people, because we really want to get to know the people working in this field, and we love to know about the organizations and all these cool things. But for you, as uniquely as being an African American executive director in this field, what have you found to be, if any, the challenges that presents to you while working in this space?
I always remind people, orchestras don't live in a vacuum, right? So when I get asked this question, I'm like, well, pull statistics of median income against different demographics, or look at the pregnancy mortality rate for Black females, or I'm like all the issues, systemic and systematic, that happen in our country obviously bleed into the field. And so it's no different than I would say than any of my colleagues in any other sector. Obviously for orchestra specifically, it is different in the sense of how the structure is. So the fact that you have different quote unquote sectors of employees. You have some that are, tenured, you have some that come and go, you have a board. And so the timeline in which those groups change makes it quite unique, because, a lot of things that we want to see in the orchestra field, I have to remind people and manage expectations of, it's not like a tech company where I can just buy out the tech company, fire everyone I don't like, and then put the people that I want in, you can't do that. It's a much slower, and also just reality of going back, I said 12 was quite late. So even for us, we have the fellowship program, which is the 26 to 40 years old, but we have several programs under that. We have Making Music, we have Chicago Musical Pathways Initiative, we have this whole pipeline. Yeah. But by the time we start that, we don't see the dividends of that maybe until 20 years later. Yeah. So we had our first C's, so that's String Ensembles for Excellence Diversity. The first student who went through that program, so think fifth grade, is now won a position in our orchestra a few years ago.
Wow.
And I'm like, that is a long time, that's a long arch in terms of planning. And so I think in terms of difficulties is no different than everything else that people see on the news. I will say it is, for our sector specifically, I'm much more concerned about removing barriers more so than I am, again, about counting numbers. So this idea of there are systemic and systematic things that, for instance, one of the pushes that I've put, I'm glad you brought up the LAO EDI committee, is about having HR departments for orchestras. So, that's still a fairly new concept. And so I obviously tripled down on our HR department, and we share all of our policies and things of that nature. And, we share what that means, but you would be surprised that the vast majority of our orchestras don't have an HR department.
Oh yeah, we know.
We don't have one.
Yeah.
So I've had to learn HR because that's now my job.
Yeah, but that's just really important, because when people think of what does EDI mean? I'm like, you can do all those things to get them in the door, but it is still for many a quite hostile environment. I remind people all the time, I go to a lot of places who they might not know who I am, right? And I am really good at blending in. I know I'm taking up a lot of space right now with the regalias and the slash, but I can blend in quite well. And I have many times terrible experiences walking into other concert halls. And so if that is my experience, I'm always curious what it is like for others who might not have the same love and affection and history for the art form as I do, because I can kind of brush it under the table and be like, yes, this happened, but look at all these other things in progress. But for just the lay person, it is still quite hostile, whether it be as an employee or just a new audience member. And so just simple things like an HR department is why I think these are problems that we can solve. So in terms of what makes it unique, I just think obviously I'm very much an insider that is really trying to push us forward. So I think it comes off a little bit differently because, again, people know me from my performance history, and they also know me just from my teachers and mentors. So I think in many ways I have it quite easy because there is a bit of trust that I have when I'm kind of introducing some of these crazier ideas.
Yeah. That's so cool.
Blake Anthony, it's been such a pleasure to talk to you today. I really wish that we could go on like this for hours, but we know that
hours. Let's do three more.
You have some limited time with us. So we would like to ask you in closing the question that we ask all of our podcast guests at the end of each episode. How do we orchestrate change?
It's always cliche, but so much of the change that at least is required in our field is really an internal process. It's not external. And so I think often I always have all these kind of like quotes in my head, but the Warren Buffett one of like, you gotta, make the choice to take a chance if you want anything to change. Yeah. There's many different iterations of that quote from different people. But I think one of the best things we can do is like, what is the individual work? I think when people think of EDIB or they think about progressing the field, they're always looking externally. And I'm like, listen, I am privy to most of the things that happens in a lot of orchestras. And I'm like, if most people just focus on the work that you need to do as an individual, that would actually be far more advantageous for the field, because it really we don't need heroes. What we really need is just a bunch of foot soldiers who are really committed and like making this art form live kind of past our specific time. And the only way to do that is to challenge yourself. And so I'm much more kind of interested in people doing that journey, because it really is a brutal internal process more than it is external.
Wow. I just thank you so much for being with us and for talking
Pleasure.
with us. I mean, you're someone that I've, ever since I got introduced to you, I respected all the work that you do, and the energy that you bring to this field is very refreshing. And it's really exciting to see someone as excited as you being in this field, because I feel like sometimes we lose that energy and that drive and that focus. And it's just really fun to talk with someone who cares so much musically, artistically, and managerially about what we do in this field. So I just want to thank you so much for speaking with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you guys for having me. This is great.
Blake Anthony Johnson, CEO of the Chicago Sinfonietta.
Orchestrating Change is a production of the Canton Symphony Orchestra.
Our theme music was composed by Eric Gould and performed by Derek Snyder and Tim Adams.
Our audio engineer is Nathan Maslick.
Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.